Chapter 11A. Meanwhile in Europe. As discussed in more detail in Cine 201, there was a thriving film industry in France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, etc. But they learned rather quickly that they would not be able to outspend Hollywood and that they would be much better off if they just did their own thing. That is a gross oversimplification, but it doesn't mean it's not true. Europeans are comfortable with film as art, with a capital A, and that there are films for entertainment that are probably American and dubbed or subtitled into their language, and then there are art films. Art films do not follow the classical Hollywood narrative style in the sense that the endings are frequently ambivalent, with an emphasis on psychological issues. Narratives may be nonlinear and full of symbols. Many European films fall into the category I like to call people talking about stuff. Sometimes that talking might lead to something happening, but it doesn't have to. Because Hollywood films have always dominated the world marketplace, European directors were raised on American films, as well as those of their own countries, but they developed their own style for telling their stories. In European films, the emphasis is on the director, like the author of a novel, and for this reason, directors of art films are often called auteurs. Because European films are considered artistic endeavors, they qualify for the same type of funding that artists might receive, so they do not have the same pressure to make $700 million on opening weekend. In France, a group of young film critics, writing for the intellectual journal Cahiers du Cinéma, Cahiers means notebook, were looking to rebel against the establishment-controlled French film industry. Never mind that the directors they were rebelling against, like Max Ophüls and Jean Renoir, had themselves been seen as revolutionary in their 20s for doing their own thing. This happens with every generation. You don't know what it's like to be young, man. Oh, don't I, son? The hippies of the 60s became the yuppies of the 80s, but I'm getting ahead of myself. These filmmakers in France, which included but were not limited to Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, and Alain Resnais, were referred to as La Nouvelle Vague, or New Wave, which is not the same new wave as the music style of the late 70s, early 80s. They wanted to see young people like themselves on screen, and they admired independent American filmmakers like John Ford, who made films their way, and not because of a studio. You may think of France as being a place where children can drink wine with their parents and morality is casual, but I can tell you that they can be even more bureaucratic than we are. It's one of those dichotomies in their culture. That so-called loose morality, by the way, usually comes from artistic expression, like novels and films, and not from actual politics. New Wave directors were innovative in taking their productions to improvised locations, mostly in Paris, which they could do because cameras were becoming more portable. The French film industry was prolific enough to need the CNC, Centre National de la Cinématographie, to coordinate the funding and distribution and exhibition of films. It is a governmental agency, but encouraged co-productions, including other countries, to minimize risk. These films don't have to make $700 million, but they do need to cover their costs. It helped immensely that New Wave films were pretty cheap to make. These filmmakers did not go to film school because that didn't really exist, but they learned by watching old movies, which they could do by going to the screenings at the Cinémathèque Française. I've done research at their library, which is the Bibliothèque de la Cinémathèque. Not a joke. Their current building was designed by architect Frank Gehry, known for his post-structuralist style seen in the Experience Music Project in Seattle, the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, and the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. But anyway, New Wave filmmakers stressed authenticity or realism. This could be your story. It was not the seamless, polished, deliciously artificial Hollywood image. Now we will look more closely at three New Wave directors. First, Alain Resnais. Unlike Godard and Truffaut, he was not a film critic, but from more of a documentary background. 1958's Hiroshima Mon Amour juxtaposes a contemporary narrative with the memory of a different affair during wartime. This is also the era for nonlinear modernist storytelling in literature, especially in France for writers inspired by Faulkner. So adaptations of those novels, like Last Year at Marienbad, are also nonlinear. Francois Truffaut is the most accessible of the New Wave filmmakers in terms of having a story with a linear plot. He is traditionalist in form, but with radical ideas. The 400 Blows takes place in a middle school, and that film's main character, Antoine Doinel, is revisited every so many years and played by the same actor, but the films are not really considered sequels. Day for Night is one of my favorite films. With DVD commentaries and entertainment news, so-called news, programs like Access Hollywood, we are used to seeing behind-the-scenes footage of TV and the film industry. But for this film in 1973, it really was unusual to peek behind the curtain in a way that was not a documentary. Godard was the most radical of the New Wave. Breathless was one of the pioneering films of the New Wave, shot on location around Paris, written, directed, and edited by Godard himself. And he was extremely prolific, making 24 films between 1960 and 1968, each one a little less structured and a little more critical of cinema as an institution, and a little more radical. Band of Outsiders, Alphaville, Pierrot le Fou, Masculine Feminine, all leading to Weekend, where a married couple, each planning to kill each other, go to see her dying father to secure her inheritance, but they wreck their car on the way and meet a lot of crazy people. Godard is really a provocateur in that he uses film to provoke and not really to tell stories.